Hello and welcome to Raj Sabha Television. I am Akhilesh Suman and you are watching Special Report. In this episode of Special Report, we are going to show you the efficacy and importance of G20, that is the grouping of 19 major nations and the European Union.
This was March 17, 2020. The world was amidst COVID-19 pandemic and no signal for any type how the nations were going to face such a situation. The questions posed on WHO and the UN were too big, too formal and seemingly too bureaucratic to deal with the situation quickly. Mostly because to maintain the social distancing, physical meetings were next to impossible. In that situation, Prime Minister Narendra Modi called up Mohammed bin Salman, the Crown Prince of the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. According to the Ministry of External Affairs, the two leaders discussed the global situation regarding the COVID-19 pandemic. Though on the surface it was a normal routine call, but it proved to be game changer.
The phone call was game changer because Prime Minister Narendra Modi suggested the idea of video conferencing among the G20 nations. Saudi Arab was the chair of G20 and the idea clicked the Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman.
The world leaders were stunned because they were foreseen that the COVID-19 was impacting not only the health and well-being of several 100,000 people, but it was also adversely affecting the economy in the world. Airports were closed, movement of people was stopped, industrial manufacturing at standstill and saving of nations depleting fast. What to do? The governments were under stress and situation could lead into anarchy if not intervened.
The situation was not a very good one because even before pandemic there were, yes, the world economy was growing, still growing, world trade was growing, but at a slower pace. There was no doubt about it. But then pandemic, as in a typical economics textbook, the way we define it, it's a kind of an external shock.
There was need to talk and there was need to deliberate seriously on global economy. G20 came handy and Mohammed bin Salman agreed for video conferencing of leaders of the group. And it took place on 26th of March 2020. Just within 10 days of telecon between Prime Minister Narendra Modi and Saudi Crown Prince bin Salman. This was called an extraordinary virtual G20 Leaders Summit. The summit had a soother impact among the leaders that they can consult and coordinate in small groupings that can impact the world in this situation when physical meetings were not possible.
That's a very natural reaction because when this is not even once in a lifetime, because we last had this kind of a pandemic in 1918 when Spanish flu in fact hit the entire world. So obviously, it was a very natural reaction to reach out to each other.
As a matter of fact, Prime Minister Narendra Modi was the first in the world to try the form of video conferencing with the leaders of different countries to coordinating in the difficult COVID-19 period. He had successfully convened the Leaders Summit of SAARC nations on 15th of March 2020. It was followed by SAARC ministers meeting and officials meeting in different rounds. G20 could quickly recognize the experience of SAARC and follow. The credit goes to G20 grouping that it could follow quickly the best practice that it saw in the past.
And that is why G20 is unique, because it came out with effective implementable solutions. After the extraordinary summit, it organized more than 50 meetings of various departments and ministries of the member nations, and it suggested solutions that could be good for not only the member nations but also other nations.
The period of 1990s. The Southeast Asian countries were creating good infrastructure and were presented as model Asian countries. But suddenly, they were gripped with acute financial crisis beginning 1997. Borrowing had increased and it was difficult for them to borrow more. They devalued their currency but lost grip on economy. Thailand, South Korea, Indonesia, Malaysia were the most affected, but and when it spread to Mexico, Russia and Brazil, the situation became alarming and was considered worldwide phenomenon.
It began in the backdrop of a financial crisis, and it actually concretized in the backdrop of another financial crisis in 2008. Asian crisis, yes, it was another financial crisis because essentially, it started in East Asia, and then in a contagion effect, it started percolating into other countries. It immediately all the countries, Thailand, Malaysia, and then even Singapore and all those countries. This is a kind of a contagion, and on the basis of which, in fact, in '99, the first, I think, finance ministers and the central bank governors meeting actually happened.
Till that time, there was G7, the grouping of most developed economies of 7 countries: Canada, France, Germany, Italy, Japan, United Kingdom, and the United States. It was considered in 1919 that even though G7 could consult among themselves as to how to keep grip over the economy, but this small group was not enough to address issues of crisis of bigger nature like that happened in late 1990s. So in 1999 G7 summit, it was decided to form another group comprising of major economies who were also heavyweights in other terms to consider economy and economy related issues. Decision to form in Cologne summit of the G7 in June 1999. Formally established at G7 finance ministers meeting on 26 September 1999. Inaugural meeting of G20 on 15-16 December 1999 in Berlin. German finance minister Hans Ickel hosted the inaugural meeting. Canadian finance minister Paul Martin was the first chairman. So, G20 became a grouping of 20 members comprised of 19 countries and European Union. These are important economies of the world and spread over different geographical regions of the globe. These are Argentina, Australia, Brazil, Canada, China, France, Germany, India, Indonesia, Italy, Japan, South Korea, Mexico, Russia, Saudi Arabia, South Africa, Turkey, United Kingdom, and United States of America, along with the European Union. So, December 1999 onward, G20 was established as a grouping of finance ministers of 19 countries and European Union.
As long as they thought that, the Japan's Nikkei, US Wall Street and the, UK stock market, these kind of places were sufficient to regulate, and then that will result into some amount of regulation in the international finance. They were happy with G7, but then once, then India came into prominence, and China, of course, China actually came into prominence.
The importance from the economic point of view can be understood from the fact that G20 account for 90% gross world product comprising economies of the world, 80% of the world trade, and 2/3 of the world population and half of world land area. Later, it was decided to enhance its status to heads of the government's grouping, and on November 14-15, 2008, the then US President George W. Bush invited the leaders of G20 countries, creating the first ever G20 summit, to Washington, D.C.
The idea was that, all financial issues, there are, 1,000 different kind of financial issues which can be talked about, which can be discussed. And those used to be discussed in the G20 earlier. But for an international financial regulatory framework, to erecting that kind of a regulatory framework, you need the entire government's, consent, entire government's approval. So that is why all the leaders were then included. I believe this is the simple reason.
The immediate provocation of calling the first ever G20 summit was to coordinate the global response to the aftermath of the financial crisis that began in the United States by excessive risk taking by banks combined with the bursting of the United States housing bubble. This further caused the values of securities tied to the US real estate to plummet and damage the financial institutions globally, culminating with the bankruptcy of Lehman Brothers on September 15, 2008, and spread of the impact to other banks and mutual funds all over the globe in international banking crisis known as subprime crisis.
Banking, that people actually have started adopting a lot of Basel norms and other kind of things. But that is not the end of all, because each and every country has its own kind of needs and own kind of objectives also. So obviously they will also customize their entire structure, not only financial structure, their entire economic structure according to their needs and their objectives also.
It was understood how closely related the global economic systems are. Super rich and developing economies needed to come together to avert such crisis in the future if it came. However, it was also underscored that there was a need to avert the crisis before it came, and so the summit-level dialogue was considered further too. British Prime Minister Gordon Brown hosted the second G20 summit in London on April 1st and 2nd, 2009. It was followed by the third G20 summit hosted by the US President Barack Obama in Pittsburgh on September 24th and 25th, 2009, with the fourth summit co-chaired by Canadian Prime Minister Stephen Harper and Korean President Lee Myung-bak in Toronto on June 26 and 27, 2010.
I would rather say that G20 is trying to find out some amount of common ground on which in fact all these 20 countries, and actually it is more than 20 countries because the European Union is also a part of it. So obviously there are a lot of other countries are also involved into the entire scheme of things. So if that is true, then they are actually trying to build up some amount of direction to find and some amount of common ground to find.
In order to create better bonhomie of thoughts among the leaders, an innovative method of deputing personal representatives of leaders was also made for G20. These representatives were named as Sherpa. They were also made to interact among themselves to take close look on the ideas of the G20 leaders and convey their personal understandings of their respective leaders. Thus, in January 2010, at a meeting of the G20 Sherpas in Mexico, it was decided that after the 6th summit of November 11-12, 2010, that was hosted by Korea, the G20 leaders would begin meeting more regularly and at least once annually. In the fall beginning in France in 2011, Mexico chaired the G20 in 2012.
Since G20 is a grouping of both developed and major developing economies, the holding of regular summits was not a routine. It was trying to find out solution of major economic problems too. And that is why the key strategy of G20 is consensus, not conflict.
The G20's mandate was to help shape the international agenda, to discuss economic and financial issues in areas where consensus had not yet been achieved, and to lead by example. In particular, it was seen as an important forum for the discussion of ways to prevent and resolve the international financial crisis. A significant early achievement was its endorsement of internationally accepted standards and codes aimed at improving economic and financial transparency and strengthening financial systems.
G20 is yet to become that kind of power forum which will decide what is going to happen in the Bretton Woods institutions like World Bank and IMF, and forget about G20.
Following the 11th September 2001 terror attacks in the United States, member countries took a forceful stand against the financing of terrorism and encouraged all countries to follow the suit.
Support the economy, not the terrorists. That was what India was telling all through. and G20 discussed this issue in all subsequent summits. But still, G20 has to understand that there are some countries who are supporting terrorists and they have to be taken to task.
G20 discussions also contributed to the introduction of collective action clauses in the international bond contracts and to the adoption of an informal code of conduct between major sovereign borrowers and lenders. Most recently, the group had become an important venue for discussing quota reform and representation at the International Monetary Fund. Although its initial focus was on issues related to the international financial stability, the G20 has also examined a broad range of longer-term economic issues of interest to its membership. The G20 played an important role in supporting globalization and efforts to ensure that its benefit could be shared by all, including the poorest developing countries. Other subjects studied included the effectiveness of aid programs, abuses of the financial system, development of domestic financial markets, regional economic integration, demographics, and resource security.
Fact of the matter is that a lot of other things, a lot of other socio-economic and welfare things have been added into the discussion table, and which is very positive, which I believe is a very positive thing.
Since its inception, its membership and outside observers have come to view the G20 as an important addition to the international architecture that has made valued contribution to better global governance. The group has been particularly successful in sharing experiences and exchanging views on key global issues, especially those that lend themselves to specific outcomes. The keys to its success have been the ability of the group to engage in meaningful debate, frankly and informally, and a commitment to seek consensus. The G20 must continue to build on this success, since its future role will hinge on the ability of its members to continue to collaborate in a collegial and effective manner. In the G20 summit held in 2019 in Osaka, major issues that were discussed was the menace of corruption and money laundering. This gave enough edge to respective governments to cooperate among themselves for addressing the cause and effects of corruption in both domestic and global affairs. We remain committed to play a leading role in the global efforts to prevent and fight against corruption, as well as promoting integrity by implementing the G20 Anti-Corruption Action Plan 2019-21, while strengthening synergies among related international instruments and mechanisms. Recognizing that countering corruption is an important requisite for ensuring quality and reliability of infrastructure, we welcome the compendium of good practices for promoting integrity and transparency in infrastructure development as part of our further work. We endorse the high-level principles of effective protection of whistleblowers. We renew our commitment to pursuing high-level international cooperation between G20 members in the fight against corruption and to lead by example through the effective implementation of the United Nations Convention Against Corruption, including its review process. The declaration of 2019 also decided to cleanse the menace of bribery that has been taking place in some economies. The G20 also decided to get rid of foreign bribery and criminalize it. We will intensify our efforts to combat foreign bribery and to ensure that each G20 country has a national law in force for criminalizing foreign bribery as soon as possible. We will continue practical cooperation to fight corruption and reaffirm our commitment to deny safe haven to persons sought for corruption and their proceeds of corruption consistent with our G20 and international commitments and our domestic legal systems, and will work more closely on asset recovery cooperation. We look forward to the scoping paper on international cooperation dealing with serious economic offenders and recovery of stolen assets in relation to corruption to be prepared by relevant international organizations. It was also decided to address the issues of distress migration taking place in various parts of the globe. While large movements of refugees were considered a global concern with humanitarian, political, social, and economic consequences. The G20 members emphasized the importance of shared actions to address the root causes of displacement and to respond to growing humanitarian needs.
The G20 was coming from macro to micro issues. It was not telling anyone to stop the economy for anything. It also discussed the evolving cryptocurrencies, but it always prescribed to be vigilant. And the G20 2019 Osaka summit was prophetic in the sense that it discussed the world health concern. And in 2020 came COVID-19 pandemic, not in one country, but all over the world.
In COVID-19 pandemic period, G20 virtually took lead in coordinating with major players of world economy and finance. With the presidency of G20 in the year 2020, the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia played a crucial role in leading and coordinating the G20 agenda and the global fight against COVID-19 to protect lives and livelihoods and safeguard the global economy. At the historic Extraordinary Leaders Summit held on March 26, 2020, the leaders agreed to spare no efforts to overcome the pandemic and to work alongside the international community to safeguard lives, resulting in concrete actions taken by G20 members in line with the vision to protect people and support the most vulnerable. G20 members took action to fight against the pandemic by contributing at the outset of the crisis over $21 billion directed towards diagnostics, vaccines, and the therapeutics for the benefit of humanity. In addition, G20 members rapidly acted to protect businesses, trade, jobs, and industries. Collectively, members injected $5 trillion at the beginning of the crisis, pledging new and extraordinary contributions throughout the year. Currently reaching over $11 trillion, these measures have been introduced to safeguard the global economy and protect financial systems through targeted fiscal policy, including economic measures and guarantee schemes to counteract the social, economic, and financial impacts of the pandemic. G20 members collectively put their efforts into protecting countries and populations in need, with 44 countries and over a billion people benefiting from the Debt Suspension Service Initiative, DSSI, which has made $14 billion available for these countries. So they focus all the resources on fighting the pandemic rather than servicing their debt payments. Part of G20 efforts is the G20 Action Plan, endorsed by the finance ministers and central bank governors, which lays the foundation to recovery and is built on three pillars: to save lives, support the vulnerable with international support, and maintain conditions for a strong and sustainable recovery and inclusive growth with lessons for the future. As matter of fact, 2020 will be remembered as an year of change to combat for a better future. In that context, a very effective debt restructuring service has been started by the member countries to borrower countries as a relief in COVID-19 period.
It is one of the, in my belief, this is one of the most important measures that has been actually taken and implemented on ground, by G20. So according to the Saudi Arabian representative, around 43 countries got benefited for around $14 billion dollar amount of debt servicing relief. And then as a result, these amount can immediately be used in some amount of health infrastructure or some amount of social programs and other kind of things.
Now, in order to build on these initiatives taken by G20, Saudi Arabia is going to organize the formal G20 summit on 21st and 22nd of November via virtual means. The Saudi Arabian presidency has selected the theme, Realizing Opportunities of the 21st Century for All. The three key agenda items to be addressed under this theme are empowering people by creating the conditions in which all people, especially women and youth, can live, work and thrive. Safeguarding the planet by fostering collective efforts to protect our global commons and shaping new frontiers by adopting long-term and bold strategies to share benefits of innovation and technological advancement.
In view of this entire pandemic, and more specifically, I wish that when the vaccine comes in, the distribution of vaccine and the inoculation of global population is done as effectively as efficiently as possible, and G20 takes a very proactive kind of a step in ensuring that.
Efforts and coordination capacities of G20 has shown its effect during COVID-19 period. The time now is to consolidate on these achievements and initiatives. As Prime Minister Narendra Modi had said in the extraordinary summit of G20 that the global growth needs to be human-centric. How the message percolates down to the other members and rest of the countries of the world will decide the future of the globe.
There is no doubt G20 has emerged as a major grouping to create consensus to find solutions. Sometimes because of its mere diversity, it looks like a mini United Nations. And the spirit of G20 to find consensus may help United Nations system too. And that's all in this report today by Akhilesh Suman with camera person Raj Thakur and assistant Hari for Rajya Sabha Television.